The morning sun painted the gates of Buckingham Palace in golden light. It was one of those perfect London days that tourists dream about. The sky was clear blue, not a single cloud in sight. The kind of day that makes you forget about all your worries and just enjoy being alive. Captain James stood perfectly still at his post. His red uniform was spotless, every button polished to shine like mirrors. His tall black hat, the famous bearskin that weighs almost 2 pounds, sat perfectly on his head. He had been doing this job for 12 years now. 12 years of standing guard, protecting the royal family and making sure everything ran smoothly. People often asked him if it was boring, standing there for hours without moving. But James loved his job. There was something special about being part of something bigger than yourself, something that had been going on for hundreds of years. He was a link in a chain that stretched back through history. The tourists were already gathering. It was only 9 in the morning, but hundreds of people were pushing against the metal barriers. They came from all over the world to see this ceremony. James could hear different languages being spoken around him. Spanish, French, German, Japanese. It made him smile inside, though his face remained completely serious. A little girl with pigtails was standing right in front of him. She kept trying to make him laugh by making funny faces. Her mother was taking pictures, trying to get the perfect shot. The girl waved at James, but he couldn't wave back. That was the rule. Royal guards don't move unless they absolutely have to. Behind the barriers, street performers were entertaining the waiting crowds. A man was juggling while riding a unicycle. Another was doing magic tricks that made children clap and cheer. The atmosphere was festive, like a big outdoor party. James had seen thousands of these ceremonies. He knew exactly what would happen and when. At 11:15, the new guards would march out from Wellington Barracks. They would be led by a military band playing traditional music. The drums would beat in perfect rhythm as they marched down the mall. The ceremony itself was like a carefully choreographed dance. Every step, every movement, every command had been practiced hundreds of times. The guards would form neat lines, present their weapons, and perform the ancient ritual of changing positions. It was beautiful to watch, like poetry in motion, but today felt different somehow. James couldn't put his finger on it, but something in the air seemed strange. Maybe it was just his imagination. After 12 years of doing the same thing, maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. The crowd was getting bigger by the minute. Tour guides were explaining the history of the ceremony to their groups. James could hear one of them talking about how the tradition started over 350 years ago, how it began as a practical way to change the soldiers guarding the palace, but over time became a ceremony that the whole world loved to watch. A young couple was taking selfies near James's position. They were trying to get him in the background, whispering to each other about whether he would smile if they asked nicely. James had heard this conversation thousands of times before. The answer was always no, but people kept trying anyway. Security officers were walking through the crowd, their eyes constantly scanning for anything unusual. They wore plainclothes, but James could spot them easily. They had a certain way of walking, a certain alertness that marked them as professionals. Their job was to watch the watchers to make sure everyone was safe. The morning was warming up nicely. James could feel sweat starting to form under his heavy uniform, but he didn't let it bother him. He had learned long ago how to ignore physical discomfort. It was part of the training, part of being a professional soldier. More and more people kept arriving, families with children, elderly couples, groups of teenagers on school trips. They all had one thing in common: they were excited to be here. Their faces showed wonder and anticipation. For many of them, this was the highlight of their London vacation. James noticed a street artist drawing portraits of tourists for 20 pounds each. The man was very skilled, capturing people's faces in just a few minutes with quick, confident strokes of his pencil. A queue was forming as people waited their turn to be drawn. The smell of hot dogs and coffee was drifting over from the food vendors across the street. James's stomach growled quietly, reminding him that he had only grabbed a quick cup of tea before starting his shift, but he pushed the hunger aside. He would eat properly after the ceremony was over. A group of American tourists was asking their guide about the guards' uniforms. The guide explained how the red color came from the old British Army tradition, and how the bearskin hats were originally worn to make soldiers look taller and more intimidating in battle. The tourists were fascinated, taking notes and asking more questions. James could see his fellow guards taking their positions at other posts around the palace. They all looked as professional and focused as he felt. It was a source of pride for him, being part of this elite group. Not everyone could do this job. It required discipline, dedication, and absolute reliability. The palace itself looked magnificent in the morning light. Its gray stone walls had witnessed so much history. Kings and queens had lived here for centuries. Important decisions that shaped the world had been made behind those windows. James felt honored to be protecting such an important place. Children were running around between their parents' legs, too excited to stand still. Their energy was infectious, spreading through the crowd like ripples on a pond. Even the adults seemed to catch some of their enthusiasm, smiling and chatting with strangers they had just met. But then James noticed something that made him pay closer attention. There was a man standing about 30 feet away from his position. The man wasn't taking pictures like everyone else. He wasn't talking to anyone or looking around with wonder. Instead, he kept checking his watch and looking nervous. The man was wearing a dark jacket despite the warm weather. His hands kept moving to his chest as if he was checking something hidden inside his coat. His behavior stood out because everyone else was relaxed and happy, but he looked tense and worried. James had been trained to notice things like this. In his years of service, he had learned to read people. Most tourists behaved in predictable ways. They took photos, they talked excitedly, they tried to get closer to the guards. But this man was different. Still, James couldn't move from his position to investigate. The rules were clear. Royal guards stayed at their posts unless there was an immediate emergency. All he could do was keep watching and hope that the security officers would notice the same thing he had. The man kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His eyes were darting around the crowd, but not in the curious way that normal tourists looked around. He seemed to be studying the layout, counting the guards, looking for something specific. James felt his training kicking in. All his senses became sharper. He was still standing perfectly still, but inside he was completely alert. Every muscle in his body was ready to spring into action if needed. The crowd continued to grow. The ceremony would start in just over an hour, and word was spreading that this was going to be one of the biggest crowds they had seen all year. The weather was perfect. School holidays had just started, and tourists were flooding into London from all over the world. But James's attention kept returning to the nervous man in the dark jacket. Something about him just didn't feel right. In 12 years of doing this job, James had developed an instinct for danger. And right now that instinct was telling him to be very, very careful. The man suddenly started moving through the crowd, pushing past families and excuse-meing his way closer to the palace gates. Closer to where James was standing. And with each step he took, James could see that his face was getting more determined, more focused. Something was about to happen. James could feel it in his bones. This perfect morning, this beautiful ceremony, this happy crowd, it was all about to change. And there was nothing he could do except stand at his post and wait to see what would unfold. The man was now just 20 feet away, still moving closer. James could see sweat on his forehead despite the comfortable temperature. The man's hand was inside his jacket now, gripping something that James couldn't see. The ceremony was about to begin, but James had a feeling that what was coming next would be unlike anything he had experienced in his 12 years of service. The perfect day was about to become something much more complicated, much more dangerous and much more human than anyone in that crowd could possibly imagine. The sound of marching drums echoed across the palace courtyard. The ceremony had officially begun. The crowd pressed forward against the barriers, everyone wanting to get the best view possible. Cameras were clicking constantly, phones were recording, and children were being lifted onto their parents' shoulders. James could hear the military band approaching from Wellington Barracks. The familiar tune of the British Grenadiers filled the air. It was a sound he had heard thousands of times before, but it never failed to give him goosebumps. There was something magical about the combination of music, tradition, and pageantry. The tourists were getting more excited by the minute. Tour guides were providing running commentary in different languages. Japanese visitors were bowing politely as they took photos. A group of French students was giggling and trying to copy the guards' serious expressions. But James's attention was still focused on the man in the dark jacket. He had stopped moving, and was now standing directly in front of the palace gates, about 15 feet from James's position. The man's behavior was becoming more erratic by the minute. He kept mumbling to himself and checking his watch every few seconds. The new guards were now visible in the distance, marching in perfect formation down the mall. Their red uniforms created a river of color flowing toward the palace. The crowd erupted in excited chatter and applause. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. James tried to catch the eye of one of the plainclothes security officers, but they were all focused on managing the growing crowd. More people were arriving every minute, pushing the barriers to their limits. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The man in the jacket suddenly started talking louder. James could hear fragments of what he was saying. Something about unfair treatment and nobody listens and they need to pay attention. His voice was getting more agitated, more desperate. A family with small children moved closer to where the man was standing. James wanted to warn them somehow, but he couldn't break protocol. All he could do was watch and hope that whatever was bothering the man, he would work it out peacefully. The marching band was getting closer now. The sound of their instruments mixed with the rhythmic thump of boots on pavement. The precision of their movements was amazing to watch. Every step was perfectly timed. Every musician was in exactly the right position. James had been part of ceremonies like this many times before. He knew that in about 10 minutes the actual changing of the guard would begin. The old guard would hand over responsibility to the new guard in a ceremony that had remained unchanged for generations. But something was going very wrong with the man in the jacket. His mumbling was getting louder and angrier. People around him were starting to notice his strange behavior. Some were moving away, sensing that something wasn't right. The man suddenly reached inside his jacket with both hands. James's heart rate spiked immediately. In his years of training, he had learned to recognize threatening movements. This was definitely one of them. What the man pulled out made James's blood run cold. It looked exactly like a handgun. Black metal, the right size and shape held in the way that someone familiar with weapons would hold it. James couldn't tell from his position whether it was real or fake, but that didn't matter. The crowd's reaction would be the same either way. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The man was holding the weapon at his side, not yet pointing it at anyone. The people immediately around him hadn't noticed yet, because they were all looking toward the approaching guards. The music was still playing. The ceremony was still proceeding normally. James faced an impossible situation. His training told him to assess the threat and respond appropriately. But his orders told him to remain at his post unless directly commanded otherwise. He was caught between two sets of instructions that suddenly seemed to contradict each other. The man was now raising the weapon. Slowly, deliberately, he pointed it directly at James. The metal barrel was aimed straight at his chest from less than 15 feet away. James could see the man's hand shaking, could see the wild look in his eyes. That's when everything exploded into chaos. A woman standing next to the man looked down and saw the gun. Her scream pierced through the music and chatter like a knife. "Gun! He's got a gun!" she shouted at the top of her lungs. The effect was immediate and terrifying. People started screaming and running in all directions. Parents grabbed their children and fled. Elderly visitors were knocked down in the rush to escape. The organized, happy crowd became a panicked mob in seconds. Security officers were suddenly everywhere, shouting commands into their radios. "Armed individual at position 3. Clear the area." All units respond. But the crowd was so dense and panicked that they couldn't get through quickly. James found himself in the eye of the storm. The man with the gun was still pointing it directly at him, but now he was shouting over the chaos. "Nobody move. Everyone needs to listen to me. I'm tired of being ignored." The ceremony had stopped completely. The marching band faltered and went silent. The approaching guards had been warned through their earpieces and were taking defensive positions. What had been a beautiful celebration just moments before was now a potential tragedy. James could see the terror in people's faces as they ran past him. A little girl who had been making faces at him earlier was crying in her mother's arms as they fled. An elderly man had fallen down and was struggling to get back up while people stepped around him. The man with the gun was crying now, tears streaming down his face. "I served my country," he was shouting. "I gave everything, but nobody cares when you come home broken. Nobody wants to help." James began to understand what was happening. This wasn't a terrorist attack or a robbery. This was a cry for help from someone who felt completely abandoned by the world. Someone who had reached the end of his rope and didn't know what else to do. but understanding the situation didn't make it less dangerous. The weapon was still pointed at James's chest. One wrong move, one sudden sound, one moment of panic, and someone could get seriously hurt or killed. The crowd was still fleeing, but some people were trapped behind barriers or caught in the rush. James could hear children crying and adults shouting for help. The beautiful morning had turned into a nightmare in less than 30 seconds. Police sirens were wailing in the distance, getting closer by the minute. Marksmen were taking positions on the palace roof. Negotiators were being called in. The full machinery of emergency response was spinning into action. But for now, it was just James and the man with the gun, facing each other across 15 feet of space that might as well have been 1,000,000 miles. The man was shaking harder now, the weapon wobbling in his grip. "Please," the man was saying, though it was hard to hear over the continued screaming and chaos. "Please just listen to me. That's all I want. Someone to listen." James realized that this moment would define not just his own life, but potentially the lives of everyone around him. Everything he had learned in 12 years of service, everything he believed about duty and honor and protecting people, was about to be tested in the most extreme way possible. The weapon was still pointed at his heart. The man's finger was on the trigger. Security forces were closing in but weren't close enough yet, and James had to make a decision that could save lives or cost them. In the distance, the marching band's instruments lay scattered on the ground where the musicians had dropped them to take cover. The ceremony that had started so perfectly was forgotten. All that mattered now was the next few minutes and what happened between two men who had never met before but whose lives had suddenly become completely intertwined. The crowd screaming was getting quieter as people escaped to safety, but the tension was only getting stronger. James could feel his heart pounding under his heavy uniform. The moment of truth was coming, and whatever happened next would change everything forever. Time seemed to move in slow motion. James could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The man with the gun was less than 15 feet away. The weapon still pointed directly at his chest. Around them, the last of the fleeing crowd was disappearing behind barriers and around corners. Security officers had formed a perimeter, but they were keeping their distance. James could see red laser dots dancing on nearby walls. Marksmen had taken their positions and were waiting for orders. Everyone was watching. Everyone was ready to act, but nobody wanted to make the first move. The man with the gun was shaking harder now. Tears were streaming down his face, but his grip on the weapon remained steady. 12 years, he was saying, his voice breaking with emotion. 12 years I served. 3 tours overseas. Lost friends. Saw things no person should see. And for what? James's mind was racing. His training had prepared him for many situations, but nothing quite like this. Every instinct told him to take cover, to call for backup, to treat this as a standard threat situation. But something deeper, something more human was telling him that this required a different approach. The man continued talking, his voice getting louder and more desperate. "I came home and nobody wanted to know. Couldn't find work. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't forget. And when I asked for help, they gave me forms to fill out and told me to wait. Always wait. Wait for appointments, wait for treatment, wait for someone to care." James could see security officers moving closer, using abandoned barriers and equipment as cover. Their weapons were drawn, their faces tense with concentration. One wrong move from anyone and this situation could explode into violence. But James was beginning to see something that the others might have missed. This man wasn't a terrorist or a criminal. He was a soldier, a brother in arms who had served his country and come home broken. Someone who felt invisible, forgotten, abandoned by the very people he had sworn to protect. The gun was still pointed at James, but the man's eyes were looking past him now, addressing the crowd that was no longer there. "I just wanted someone to listen," he said. "Someone to understand that we exist, that we matter, that we didn't disappear when the wars ended." That's when James made a decision that went against everything he had been taught about protocol and procedure. Instead of waiting for orders or backup, instead of treating this as a security threat, he chose to see it as something else entirely. A human being in crisis who needed help, not bullets. Slowly, deliberately, James began to move. He reached up with both hands toward his famous bearskin hat. The movement was so unexpected that it caused a ripple of confusion through the watching security team. What was he doing? Why was he moving when protocol demanded absolute stillness? The man with the gun noticed the movement immediately. His grip tightened on the weapon, his eyes focusing sharply on James for the first time. "Don't move!" he shouted. I said don't move. But James continued with his careful, deliberate action. He lifted the heavy bearskin hat from his head, revealing his closely cropped brown hair underneath. The hat weighed almost 2 pounds, and removing it felt like shedding a layer of official armor. The watching crowd, those who hadn't fled and were observing from safe distances, gasped audibly. Royal Guards never removed their hats during duty. Never. It was unthinkable, unheard of, completely against regulations. What was he doing? James held the hat for a moment, then slowly, carefully placed it on the ground beside his feet. The action was so simple, so human, so unexpected that it seemed to create a moment of silence in the chaos. Even the police radios seemed to go quiet. "What are you doing?" the man with the gun asked, his voice confused now rather than angry. "Why did you do that?" James looked directly into the man's eyes for the first time. Not at the weapon, not at the threat, but at the person holding it. When he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and completely human. "Because you're not just a problem to be solved," James said. "You're a person who's hurting, and you deserve to be heard." The words hung in the air between them. The man's hands were still shaking, but something in his expression began to change. The desperate anger was still there. But now it was mixed with surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hope. "My name is James," the guard continued, taking a single small step forward. The movement caused immediate tension among the watching security team, but James ignored their presence completely. "I'm a soldier too. Have been for 12 years, and I know what it's like to come home from places that change you forever." The man with the gun blinked hard as if trying to clear his vision. You understand?" "I understand that nobody prepares you for the quiet," James said, taking another careful step forward. He was now less than 10 feet from the weapon, well within the danger zone that all his training warned him to avoid. Nobody tells you how loud silence can be when you're used to explosions. Nobody explains how hard it is to care about normal things when you've seen what we've seen. Behind the barriers, people who had been hiding began to cautiously raise their heads. This wasn't the confrontation they had expected to see. This wasn't the standard response to an armed threat. This was something entirely different. The man's grip on the gun was loosening slightly. "They told me to be patient. Said the system would help eventually. But I've been patient for 3 years. 3 years of appointments that lead to more appointments. 3 years of being told my problems aren't urgent enough, not severe enough, not documented properly." "What's your name?" James asked, his voice gentle but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Robert," the man replied almost automatically. "Robert Chen. Corporal Robert Chen, 1st Battalion, Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment. Served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and..." His voice broke slightly. "Lost too many friends in places most people can't even pronounce. Thank you for your service." "Robert," James said, and he meant every word. "I know that might sound empty right now, but I mean it. What you did mattered, what you sacrificed mattered, and what you're feeling right now matters too." The transformation in Robert's face was visible to everyone watching. The desperate anger was giving way to something more complex. Relief at being heard, shame at the situation he had created, confusion about what to do next. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper now. I just wanted someone to pay attention, to acknowledge that we exist, that we're still here, still struggling, still need help." James nodded slowly. "I see you, Robert. We all see you now. You have our attention. You have mine, and I promise you that this won't end with you being forgotten again." The gun was no longer pointed directly at James. Robert's arms had dropped slightly, the weapon now aimed at the ground between them. The immediate threat was diminishing, but the emotional crisis was far from over. "I'm so tired," Robert said, and the exhaustion in his voice was heartbreaking. "I'm so tired of fighting to be heard. So tired of explaining why I can't just get over it and move on. So tired of pretending everything is fine when nothing has been fine for years." "You don't have to pretend anymore," James said. "Not here, not with me. I know what it's like to wake up in a cold sweat thinking you're back there. I know what it's like to feel like a stranger in your own country, your own life." Around them, the security perimeter remained tense but stable. The marksmen still had their sights trained on Robert, but the immediate sense of impending violence was fading. Something unprecedented was happening. and everyone seemed to sense that this was not the time for standard operating procedures. James could see that Robert was at a crossroads. The weapon was still in his hands. The situation was still dangerous, but the human connection that was forming between them offered a different path forward. A path that didn't end in tragedy, but in understanding and help. The next few minutes would determine whether this moment of connection could overcome years of pain and frustration, whether two soldiers could find a way forward that honored both duty and humanity. The weapon in Robert's hands was shaking more violently now, but not from anger anymore. It was shaking from the emotional weight of finally being heard, finally being seen as more than just a problem or a statistic. James could see the internal battle playing out on the man's face. "Tell me about Afghanistan," James said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for Robert to hear. "Which base were you at?" Robert's eyes widened slightly. This wasn't the conversation he had expected to have. "Camp Bastion," he replied automatically. 2018 to 2019, you? Helmand Province, 2016, James answered. Different time, same sand, same heat, same feeling that you're a long way from home. A ghost of a smile crossed Robert's face. The sand that gets everywhere. In your gear, your food, your clothes. No matter how careful you are, you're always finding it weeks later. And the sounds, James continued, taking another small step closer. The way the wind sounds different there. The way silence feels heavy, like it's holding its breath. Robert nodded, his grip on the weapon continuing to loosen. People here don't understand the sounds. They complain about traffic noise, construction work, but they don't know what real noise is. They don't know what it's like when the quiet is more terrifying than the explosions. Behind the security perimeter, James could see officers speaking urgently into their radios. This was completely off script, completely against protocol, but it was working. The immediate threat was diminishing with each passing minute. What was the hardest part about coming home? James asked. He was now close enough to see the details of Robert's face, the exhaustion in his eyes, the lines that came from seeing too much too young. The speed, Robert replied without hesitation. Everything moves so fast here. People complaining about their coffee being too cold, getting angry about delayed trains. And you want to shake them and say, "Do you know how good you have it? Do you know what real problems look like?" James nodded. The disconnect. You come back and everyone expects you to just slot back into normal life. But normal doesn't exist anymore. You've changed, but everything else pretends to be the same. Exactly. Robert's voice got stronger, more animated. They ask how you are, but they don't really want to know. They want you to say fine so they can move on to talking about their own problems. They don't want to hear about the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way crowds make you nervous. James could see tears forming in Robert's eyes. Not tears of anger anymore, but tears of relief. The relief of finally being understood by someone who had walked a similar path. And the guilt, Robert continued. The guilt of surviving when others didn't. The guilt of struggling when everyone tells you that you should be grateful to be alive. The guilt of needing help when you're supposed to be strong. Survivor's guilt is real, James said. It doesn't make you weak or ungrateful. It makes you human. It means you cared about the people you served with. Robert was crying openly now. I lost my best friend in Kabul, Tommy Williams. We grew up on the same street, joined up together, served 3 tours together. He stepped on an IED 6 months before we were supposed to come home. I was 20 meters away when it happened. I'm sorry for your loss, James said, and the weight of those words carried across the space between them. Tommy would want you to get help. He'd want you to find a way forward. I tried, Robert said, his voice breaking. I tried so hard to get help. But the system, the bureaucracy, they make you feel like you're begging for something you don't deserve. Forms and appointments and waiting lists and more forms. James nodded grimly. I know, I've been through it too. The appointments where they ask you to rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10, as if emotional trauma can be quantified like a broken bone. You've been through the system? Robert asked, surprise evident in his voice. PTSD counseling, anxiety management, sleep disorder treatment, James listed. It took me 2 years to get the help I needed, and I had to fight for every appointment. The system isn't designed for people like us. It's designed for people who understand bureaucracy better than they understand trauma. Robert was looking directly at James now, the weapon hanging loose in his hands. How did you get through it? How did you find a way to function? Slowly, James replied honestly. 1 day at a time. Some days were better than others. Some days I didn't think I could make it, but I found people who understood. Other veterans, counselors who had military experience, support groups where I didn't have to explain myself. Support groups? Robert asked. I looked into those, but they all seemed so clinical, like therapy disguised as conversation. Not all of them, James said. There are informal groups, guys who meet for coffee or go for walks. No paperwork, no appointments, just people who get it. People who know that sometimes you need to talk about the bad stuff. And sometimes you just need to sit in comfortable silence with someone who understands why you're quiet. The security perimeter was still holding, but James could see officers relaxing slightly. The conversation had been going on for almost 20 minutes now, and the immediate dangers seemed to be passing. But everyone remained alert, ready to act if the situation changed. I haven't had a real conversation in months, Robert admitted. Not about the things that matter. My family tries, but they don't understand. My friends from before, we don't have anything in common anymore. I feel like I'm speaking a different language. You are, James said. We all are. Military experience changes the way you see everything. Priorities, risks, what matters and what doesn't. It's like living in a parallel world where everyone else is worried about things that seem trivial. Robert looked down at the weapon in his hands as if seeing it for the first time. This isn't real, he said quietly. The gun. It's a replica. I bought it online. I wanted people to take me seriously. I wanted someone to listen. James felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he didn't let it show on his face. I know, he said calmly. I could tell by the way you were holding it. You're not here to hurt anyone, Robert. You're here because you're in pain and you don't know what else to do. I feel so stupid, Robert said, his voice barely audible. Look what I've done. All these people running scared, all this chaos. I never wanted to frighten anyone. You're not stupid, James replied firmly. You're desperate. There's a difference. Desperate people do desperate things, especially when they feel like no one is listening. What happens now? Robert asked, and for the first time his voice carried hope instead of despair. How does this end? James could see security officers moving closer, but he held up a subtle hand signal to keep them back. This was the crucial moment. Robert was ready to surrender, but it had to happen in the right way, with dignity and respect intact. Now you put down the replica and let me help you find the real support you need, James said. Not the bureaucratic runaround, not the endless waiting list, but actual help from people who understand what you've been through. You would do that? Robert asked, disbelief evident in his voice. After everything I've put you through today? Robert, James said, his voice filled with conviction, you're my brother. We served the same flag, we took the same oath, we faced the same dangers. That doesn't end just because we came home. We look after each other. That's what soldiers do. For the first time since the crisis began, Robert smiled. It was a small smile, fragile and uncertain, but it was real. And in that smile, James could see the man Robert had been before the war, before the trauma, before the system failed him. The replica weapon was hanging from Robert's fingers now, no longer a threat to anyone. The immediate crisis was over, but the real work of healing was just beginning. Robert looked down at the replica weapon in his hands one last time. 25 minutes had passed since he first pointed it at James, 25 minutes that had felt like a lifetime. Slowly, carefully, he bent down and placed it on the ground between them. I'm sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry for all of this. James stepped forward and kicked the replica weapon away from both of them, a signal to the watching security officers that the immediate threat was over. But instead of stepping back, he moved closer to Robert. Don't apologize for being in pain, James said. Apologize for not asking for help sooner. Security officers were moving in now, but James held up his hand again. Give us a minute, he called out, please. Just one more minute. The senior officer on scene spoke into his radio, then nodded to James. They would wait. They understood that something important was happening here. Something that went beyond standard procedure. What's going to happen to me? Robert asked, looking around at all the armed officers surrounding them. You're going to be taken into custody, James said honestly. There's no way around that. But I'm going to make sure you get the right kind of help, not just punishment. This isn't a criminal matter, it's a mental health crisis. Robert nodded, accepting his fate. Will I see you again? Count on it, James replied. I meant what I said about looking after each other. This doesn't end here. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. Robert was carefully handcuffed and led away, but not roughly. The officers had heard enough of the conversation to understand that this wasn't a typical arrest. Mental health specialists were called instead of just regular police backup. James picked up his bearskin hat from where he had placed it on the ground. The simple act of putting it back on felt strange after everything that had happened. He was returning to being a royal guard, but he was also forever changed by the last half hour. The crowd that had fled in terror began to slowly return. News cameras arrived, drawn by reports of an armed incident at Buckingham Palace. But what they found wasn't the aftermath of violence. Instead, they found a story of human connection, understanding, and compassion. Within hours, video footage of the incident was spreading across social media. Someone in the crowd had filmed James removing his hat and talking to Robert. The footage was shaky and the audio wasn't perfect, but the emotion was clear. Royal Guard saves lives with compassion instead of force, read one headline. When protocol met humanity, humanity won, read another. The story wasn't just news in Britain, it was international news. People around the world were talking about the guard who chose to listen instead of react. But for James, the real story was just beginning. That evening, after his shift ended and he had been debriefed by multiple agencies, he drove to the secure facility where Robert was being held for psychiatric evaluation. "I didn't think you'd actually come," Robert said when James was allowed to visit. "I told you I would," James replied. "How are they treating you?" "Better than I expected," Robert admitted. "They have a psychiatrist here who understands military trauma. For the first time in years, someone is asking the right questions instead of just filling out forms." Over the following weeks, James visited Robert regularly. He helped connect him with veteran support groups that actually worked, not just official programs but informal networks of people who understood. He introduced Robert to other soldiers who had successfully navigated the transition from military to civilian life. The legal proceedings were complicated, but ultimately fair. Robert was charged with causing public alarm, but the judge took into account his military service, his mental health struggles, and the fact that no one was actually harmed. Instead of prison, he was sentenced to community service and mandatory counseling, which he was already receiving. The media attention brought unexpected benefits. Donations poured in for veteran mental health charities. Politicians suddenly found themselves being asked tough questions about support for returning soldiers. The bureaucratic system that had failed Robert and countless others faced public scrutiny for the first time in years. James found himself at the center of a national conversation about how society treats its veterans. He gave interviews, spoke at conferences, and worked with charities to improve support systems. The military initially wasn't sure how to handle his breach of protocol, but public support for his actions made it impossible to discipline him. 6 months after that dramatic morning at Buckingham Palace, James received a letter. The handwriting was neat and careful, and he recognized it immediately. "Dear James," it began, "I wanted you to know that I have a job now. Nothing fancy, just working in a warehouse, but it's honest work, and my colleagues know about my service. They respect it instead of seeing it as a problem. I also have my own flat, small but clean, and I'm sleeping better than I have in years. The counseling is helping. I still have bad days, but I also have good ones now. I've joined a hiking group for veterans, and we meet every weekend. Sometimes we talk about the war. Sometimes we just walk in comfortable silence. Both are exactly what I need. I think about Tommy often, but the guilt is different now. Instead of guilt for surviving, I feel responsible for living well. For making my life mean something. For helping other people who are struggling the way I was. I wanted to thank you for seeing me as a person instead of just a problem, for listening when no one else would, for showing me that asking for help isn't giving up. It's the first step toward getting better. I know I put you in an impossible situation that day, and I know you could have handled it very differently. The fact that you chose compassion over protocol saved my life in more ways than one. I'm volunteering now with a crisis helpline for veterans. Funny how life works. The person who felt like no one would listen is now spending his time listening to others. Your example showed me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply hear someone. Really hear them. I hope you know that what you did that day rippled out far beyond just helping me. The attention it brought to veteran mental health issues has led to real changes. Waiting lists are shorter, funding has increased, and there are new programs specifically designed for people like us. Thank you for reminding me that I matter, that my service meant something, and that there are people who care. Thank you for showing me that the brotherhood of soldiers doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Your friend and fellow soldier, Robert? James read the letter 3 times before carefully folding it and putting it in his wallet. That evening, he drove to the same secure facility where Robert had been held. But this time he was visiting someone else. Another veteran in crisis who had heard about what happened and specifically asked to speak with the guard who understood. The cycle was continuing, but in the best possible way. One conversation had led to another. One connection had created a network of support. One moment of choosing humanity over protocol had changed countless lives. A year later, James was still a royal guard, still standing at his post at Buckingham Palace. But everything was different now. The tourists still took pictures, children still tried to make him smile, and the ceremony still proceeded with its ancient dignity. But now, when James stood at his post, he wasn't just protecting the palace. He was carrying forward a new understanding of what it means to serve, what it means to protect, and what it means to see the person behind the problem. The bearskin hat on his head felt different now. It wasn't just a symbol of tradition and authority. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons, but with words. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from following orders, but from following your conscience, and sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is simply remove your hat, look another person in the eye and say, I see you. I hear you. You matter. The morning sun still painted the palace gates in golden light. Tourists still gathered to watch the ceremony. But now, sometimes, James would notice someone in the crowd who looked troubled, isolated, or in pain. And he would remember that everyone has a story. Everyone is fighting battles that others can't see, and everyone deserves to be heard. The perfect day that had turned into a crisis had ultimately become something even better. A reminder that at the heart of all service, all duty, and all honor, there is one simple truth. We are all human beings, and we all need each other. Robert's story became a symbol of hope for veterans around the world. But James's story became something equally important, a reminder that compassion is not weakness, that listening is not passive, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against despair is simply the willingness to see another person's humanity. The changing of the guard ceremony continues every day at Buckingham Palace, just as it has for centuries. But now it carries an additional meaning. A reminder that the most important changes aren't always the ones we plan for, but the ones that happen when we choose to care more about people than we do about protocol.